Hello! Once again, it is I, Jean-Henri Chandler, come back to take you on a little journey about 4 centuries into the past, deep into a time tunnel, into what we call the early modern era, or what you could probably also call the late medieval period. And today we're going to look at a real interesting episode in the life of one of the more famous characters from this era, Nicolaus Copernicus, or Nicolaus Copernicus, or by many other pronunciations and versions of his name. This fellow was a very well-known astronomer and is known today mainly as somebody you study in physics class or in sort of basic science class in middle school as the person who first publicly advanced the heliocentric theory of the universe, that being the idea that the sun, rather than the earth, is the center of our local celestial neighborhood. And we generally, today, we have lots of astronomers, and most of these folks are extremely specialized, and that's partly because astronomy and astrophysics and all these related fields are so complicated and so in-depth that it's quite challenging to do much else than that. If you want to be competent at astronomy, you don't have that necessarily all that much time to learn other things. But it's not like it was really simple in the days of Copernicus either, because there was so much to learn. And they just had a different approach. Copernicus was what we would call today a Renaissance man. And this type of character that he was, he's a little bit of a classic example of a person from his time, not necessarily perhaps as much of an outlier as we tend to think. We have an approach to history that focuses on super individuals that take us by enormous leaps and bounds from one era to the next. But we're going to take a little look at Copernicus, and mostly to do with an incident in his life that almost nobody's heard about, even though it's not exactly hidden. But it's because of the way we look at these subjects. We look at Copernicus for astronomy. We don't think about the other things that happened in his life, and we don't think about the kind of person he was. So today what we're going to look at is a battle that Copernicus was involved in, and was in fact the commander of one group of defending a town against the forces of the Teutonic Order, which was a religious organization of brother knights or monk knights, friar knights, who were extremely militarily capable fanatics who had been involved heavily in what we call the Northern Crusades, and had helped cause the forced conversion to Christianity of a lot of the people in the Baltic, which was one of the last parts of Europe that remained pagan. And the last of them converted technically in the late 14th century, although because of the nature of the final conversion, it probably took about 100 years, because the final conversion of the Lithuanians to Christianity did not happen by the methods of the Teutonic Knights, which was by the sword, as it was said in those days, but rather it was something they achieved diplomatically through their other neighbor, Poland. And this is kind of at the heart of what was going on during the life of Copernicus. So we're gonna focus in on his life, and we're not going to do it the way you did in middle school science class or undergrad astronomy class, where we're just going to only focus on some of the theological and philosophical details and technical details of his astronomy. But we're going to look at a little bit at his whole life and how he ended up in a battle and what happened during that battle. So first, for a little bit of background, and I'm not going to get super deep into this because this is definitely going to be a subject of another couple of videos, but Nicolaus Copernicus lived in a region of what's now Poland that was known as Prussia, and it was a zone that had been occupied until fairly late, until the 13th century, 14th century. It had been under the control of pagan ethnic Baltic people who were called Prussians. Prussians is a really tricky term because Prussian gets applied to the original people that live in this region that are from this Baltic ethnicity, who are also related to Latvians and Lithuanians. But it is also applied to the German people that moved into this region and who created a country there in the 18th century, and to the region of Poland that which is where this place is. It's what's now in northern Poland, and in a lot of other ways. So we have to be careful with that terminology. But these people, the Prussians, were not Christian, and they had been, I would argue that they were somewhat enculturated into something very similar and what previously had been closely linked to the pagan Viking culture of the Swedes and Danes that was their neighbors across the Baltic. And they were involved in raiding and plundering, and they also traded, but they were warlike people, and they were difficult people to be neighbors with, especially for Christians. And for a long time, Christians and these pagan folks did not get along. It was like oil and water. And it was a very dangerous neighborhood because not only did you have Christians living next to Baltic pagan folks, but there were also the Mongols nearby, and the Mongol satraps, the polities that had fallen under the control of the Mongols, like Muscovy, which is more or less now Russia, which were aggressive and expansionist and ruthless polity. Everybody was. I mean, it was a tough time. And the Teutonic Knights had originally been formed to help participate in the Crusades in Levant, in what's now the Syria, Lebanon, Israel area, Egypt. But by the time they were organized and got down there, they basically got involved in the very end of it and had to leave because the place had been reconquered by the Mamluks, which was Egyptians. So they ended up in Hungary for a while, where they were set up on the borderlands near Transylvania, and were helping to keep away the nomadic tribes, the Cumans and some other people that were active in that area. But the Hungarians grew suspicious of the Teutonic Knights, and they threw them out because the Teutonic Knights were starting to build stone castles and more permanent type settlements, and the Hungarian nobles were concerned that the Teutonic Knights were going to try to make up their own country in their border area, which is possibly true. The timing might be unfortunate because they were thrown out more or less right before the Mongols crossed the border and really wrecked Hungary. But it's one of those interesting what ifs. What would have happened if the Teutonic Knights had been there? They were pretty good at warfare, especially on the defense. But they moved north because there was an active crusade in the north that had started off with just some static that was going on between the Christian polities in Denmark and then Poland and with the Swedes a little bit. And it was a complicated thing because there were some traders that were from the Christian areas that were living with the Baltic people and seemed to get along with them fine. But when the missionaries came and sometimes when they were trying to resolve conflicts, the pagans and the Christians in the Baltic region just didn't get along. So there was a very active and bloody series of wars, which are usually called the Northern Crusades, and the Teutonic Knights got involved in that. And up until their arrival, the local Christian forces, which a lot of whom were from Denmark and from Poland and other German polities that were a little bit to the west of there, were struggling. The pagan Baltic people were really tough, and it was hard to defeat them. And they had converted to Christianity in theory, but then they had a huge unconversion war where they burned all the churches and they threw off the yoke of Christianity, which had been somewhat tied to feudalism and had put them into an inferior social status. Complicated history, but the Teutonic Knights got in there. Turned out they were very good at this. They established some territories, started building castles. They were kind of at the forefront of technology for warfare, in particular the building of castles, as well as armored heavy cavalry and the use of weapons like crossbows and a lot of other things, which I'll get into in another talk some point. But long story short is that the Teutonic Knights expanded throughout the region and conquered most of what's now called Prussia, and the land of some of these tribes that were known by various names, but Prussia is sort of the broad term that's used for that region. And they also got up into what's called Livonia, which is now where most of the Baltic states are, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. The Estonians are a little bit different in terms of their language and ethnicity. They're more closely related to the Finns, but they lived in this area of the southern Baltic too, and so they were all part of this big war. In between the Prussian area and the Livonian area, which is kind of where the Baltic states are now, were the Lithuanians, who proved to be extremely difficult to conquer and extremely warlike, and they had been kind of the dominant group. And they were also a coalition of multiple different tribes. And ultimately, the Teutonic Knights couldn't break the Lithuanians, even though they tried over and over and over and over again. They raided 2 or 3 times a year for 200 years. And in the process, the Teutonic Knights gained control over most of the towns in what we call Prussia and northern Poland. And these towns had been surveyed and, in many cases, founded either by the Teutonic Knights or by other groups of Germans and Flemish colonists that had moved east. So most of the towns were German-speaking, as were a lot of the knights in this area, although there were Poles, quite a few Poles as well. And there were these native Prussian people that lived there. The ones that were still there had become part of the army of the Teutonic Knights, and they created this massive state that's called the Orderstaat that it extended almost the equivalent distance of Houston to Miami. I'm not sure of a proper analogy for Europe other than the place itself, which extended roughly from where Gdansk is in Poland today all the way up to the northern part of Estonia and a little bit beyond, almost to the Finnish border. So a huge swath of land with this thorn in their side in between the two regions that was the Lithuanians. But the Teutonic Knights, they were very good at warfare, they were really good at fighting, but they were fanatics, and they did not get along very well with anybody that ever told them no. And what turned out eventually were that a lot of their own citizens in the towns disagreed with the Teutonic Knights. They didn't necessarily want to support endless crusading. And the Poles didn't like the fact that the Teutonic Knights took a bunch of their land. They basically just annexed vast swaths of territory in what's now northern Poland and was then ostensibly part of Poland. The Poles had participated in these crusades against the Baltic people, and they had traditionally held sway over a lot of this coastal region, but the Teutonic Knights took it away, and just, with the Teutonic Knights, it was our way or the highway. And this led to eventually Poland making diplomatic alliances with Lithuania while they were still pagan. And the Lithuanians, seeing the writing on the wall, they expressed the idea that, hey, we'd be willing to convert to Christianity, but we don't want to do it by the sword. We don't want to be conquered and forced into it. We'll do it on our own terms. And there was a little bit of a threat in the air because there was also the possibility they could convert to Islam and join with the Mongols, or they could convert to the Orthodox variation of Christianity, which the Latin people considered a schism. So the Pope, thanks to the work of some Polish lawyers, backed up the idea of Lithuania converting on their own terms, which meant, among other things, that the only priests in Lithuania were going to be Lithuanians. Eventually there were Poles as well, but they didn't want Christianity to be used as a means of pushing them down into feudalism in a sort of hierarchy underneath other ethnic groups. And they got their way. And ultimately, Poland and Lithuania formed an alliance. And this was the doom of the Teutonic Order, because they had enough trouble with the Lithuanians. The Poles were a Latinized people who had been Christian for a long time, and they had the same kinds of technological advances that the Germans did. They had stone castles, they had excellent heavy cavalry that was getting better and better. They had weapons like crossbows, and then as they started to appear, firearms, early firearms, cannons, and knew about siege warfare, and had all the classical Greco-Roman treatises on warfare, and they were equals to the Teutonic Knights on their own. And with the help of the Lithuanians, they turned out to be too much for the Teutonic Order. So in the 15th century, the glory days of the Teutonic Knights were ending. And they had also really seriously alienated some of their own cities, which became an increasing problem. In 1410, there was a huge battle, which is sometimes called the Battle of Tannenberg. It's sometimes called the Battle of Grunwald. This is basically, they're looking for the name of a little village around the site that they can pin the name of the battle to, because it was kind of in the middle of nowhere. And the long and short of that is that in 1410, the Teutonic Knights brought a huge army. The Polish brought also a big army, and the Lithuanians sent their people. And the combination of all these forces, Poles and Lithuanians and some mercenaries from the Czech region and other places, crushed the Teutonic Knights. It was one of the most decisive defeats they ever suffered. And the Teutonic Knights, reeling in defeat, faced the capture of 14,000 of their troops and their allies and their mercenaries. And the Poles, who at this point had arranged a really strange combination of diplomatic exchanges, which resulted in the king of Poland being Lithuanian. And this Lithuanian Polish king was a very reasonable diplomatic kind of guy, and he decided to parole all the German troops that he captured. And there's a variety of reasons for this, but part of it was because the Poles, even though they were at war with the Teutonic Knights, they did not want them or the German population in this area to be pushed out, because the general population density was not very high, and they had very dangerous neighbors to destroy all the Latin people in this area, which would include the Muscovites and the Mongols, and then a little further south, the Ottomans. So they also wanted to be magnanimous in victory because of the diplomatic cachet that it gave them, and because it created a sort of opening with some of these German towns. There was another war in the 1420s which came to be called the Hunger War, because both the Teutonic Knights and the Poles did a lot of scorched earth, where they just burned all the fields and the granaries and the bridges, and poisoned the wells and all that scorched earth kind of stuff, and that caused a massive famine, which then in turn caused an outbreak of plague. And the Teutonic Order lost something like 2/3 of their brother knights, which was kind of their officer cadre, from plague. And the Poles lost a lot of people too, as did all the German-speaking towns around there. And so they decided that they were going forward, even though they knew they were going to get into more wars. When they made the treaty to end that one, they established rules of war amongst the Latin people. Now, they knew if they're fighting the Mongols or whatever, that all that is out the window. When the Latin people are fighting each other, whether it's the Teutonic Knights versus the Poles, or the Poles versus the Lithuanians, or the Lithuanians versus the Teutonic Knights, or against the Swedes or the Danes or anybody else from the region, there are certain rules they were going to follow, and they were not going to do scorched earth. And then finally, the Teutonic Knights, at every turn, every time they suffered a defeat, instead of really looking at how they lost, because they didn't lose that often, they were very good warriors and very good tacticians, but they would occasionally overextend themselves and bite off more than they could chew and suffer these catastrophic losses. And every time they did, they always found a scapegoat. They always found an excuse. Not really looking at, our strategy was wrong, or we picked the wrong moment, or we took on too many enemies at the same time. But it was always like, oh, look, so-and-so, right before the battle, somebody saw this guy lower his banner or something like that. He must have been working for the other side. It was treachery. This also happened several times when they lost some big battles against the Lithuanians. And they were taking out a lot of their problems on the towns, and they were imposing really high taxes on the towns in order to help ransom some of their people back from the Poles after the defeats that they suffered. And whenever the towns did anything that they didn't like, sometimes they had differing diplomatic agendas. A lot of these towns on the coast had joined the Hanseatic League, and they were involved in their own trade issues and their own diplomatic challenges, and sort of they were dealing with countries much further to the west, like England and France, and they were not necessarily interested in endless crusades, and they certainly weren't interested in fighting Poland, which they saw Poland as a trading ally in a way, like a trading partner. And so the Teutonic Knights, faced with backtalk from their people, their attitude was to go in and cut off heads. Whereas the Poles extended diplomatic overtures and made it clear that they respected the idea of the free city. So this is another thing I've talked about some of the other my other talks. I'm not going to get into it deep here, but we had a lot of these cities were under these special town charters that made them self-managing. This was something that Teutonic Knights never really felt comfortable with, and the Teutonic Knights built castles in these cities to kind of oversee them and to make sure that they didn't stray from what the Teutonic Knights wanted them to do. And this was highly resented by the the Prussian cities, which were of mixed ethnicity. The whole region was definitely mixed, but they were mostly German-speaking. Certainly the ruling strata that left us all their records, all their legal records and their political minutes from their various meetings and so on are in German or Latin. But these people wanted to be autonomous. Their economic system worked better if they were self-managing. They resented the heavy hand of the Teutonic Knights, and in the 1440s they created something called the Prussian Confederation, which was an alliance of a bunch of these towns, and they all got together, and their real goal, ostensibly, it was to help fight off potential invaders like the Muscovites or the Mongols, but really what it was for was to resist the Teutonic Order. And in the mid-15th century, this group, the Prussian Confederation, which included about 20 towns and also about another maybe 30 noble families and a lot of what are called prelates, which are these princes of the church, bishops, archbishops, abbots, and so on. So a bunch of the important people and communities formed this group called the Prussian Confederation, and in the middle of the 15th century, in 1454, they had a huge series of uprisings where they decided to overthrow the Teutonic Knights. And what they did was they went to the castles in these towns that were run by the Teutonic Knight governors, and they destroyed them. A couple of them are just left in that state. The one in Turin, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a minute, it was just left in the state that it was in, blown up, wrecked during the uprising, and it's sort of like a symbol of the freedom of the city. The Teutonic Order was extremely tough, and they did not react well to this, and they fought a war against these towns who then appealed to Poland for assistance. So the towns decided to join with Poland, and Poland got into a war with the Teutonic Knights, because even if they granted these towns their autonomy, it would still, winning the war would give them back access to the Baltic Sea and a lot of this territory that they considered Polish. So this was called the 13 Years' War, and it went for 13 years. The Teutonic Knights were defeated once again, although it was a very difficult war. But once again, the Poles did not want to destroy the Teutonic Knights because they felt that they needed them as an occasional ally, and they didn't want to depopulate the area or wreck everything and set the technological level back, a century. And so the Teutonic Knights were still there, and they still were scheming on how to take back all their old territory, even though they were now confined to a much smaller area, which is called Ducal Prussia, and the other parts of Prussia were controlled by Poland, and they were sort of vassals of more or less semi-autonomous, but allied with Poland. Some of the pictures I'm showing you here, by the way, are from a Polish film made in 1960 called Krzyżacy, which means like Black Cross. It's basically the term for the Teutonic Knights. Polish called the Teutonic Knights. This was made by a director called Alexander Ford, based on a novel by a wonderful Nobel Prize-winning author called Henryk Sienkiewicz. Please forgive my bad pronunciation of Polish, but this guy's a really neat guy. He also made the With Fire and Sword series, which I highly recommend looking for. But anyway, that film for its time was very advanced and sophisticated and sort of realistic. But for us today, the pictures are ballpark. They're crude, but it's sort of roughly what you probably be seeing in the early 15th century for the Teutonic Knights and nobles. So enter Warmia. So Warmia is a region in this part of northern Poland that we call Prussia, and it's right on the border between the zone that was given over to Poland and to the Prussian Confederation versus the zone where the Teutonic Knights were, which they had now become based in the city of Königsgrad. Königsberg. Now it's called Kaliningrad. I kind of mashed that up. It's now a Russian enclave called Kaliningrad, but back then it was Königsberg. Pardon me. So this was one of these. This area of Warmia was one of these native Prussian regions, which was conquered during the Northern Crusades in the 13th century. It used to be called the Bishopric of Ermland, and it was established as such in 1243 by the Teutonic Knights. Most of the nobles and the townfolk in this area were German-speaking people, but there was also Polish populations in the towns, and the native population around this area were a mix of the old, what are called Old Prussians, the Baltic Prussians, and some people called Kashubians, which are a mix of Old Prussian and Polish culture, basically, and I think they were Slavic-speaking. Most of the people in this zone of Warmia were allied with Poland, even though a lot of them were German-speaking and they had German, they ate pretzels, they were German culture, but they politically allied themselves with Poland. And so one of the figures who becomes a really important person in this region in the 15th century, the later 15th century, was a guy called Lucas Vatsenrode the Younger. He was born in 1447 in this little town called Turon, which was one of the three major cities of the Prussian Confederation, along with Danzig, known as Gdansk today, and Elbing or Elblag. So those Torn, Danzig, and Elblag were the three big, powerful cities in the Prussian Confederation, along with another 15 or 16 other ones that were the sort of backbone of this uprising against the Teutonic Knights. Lucas was born in Turon, and he was from a wealthy merchant family. The origin of the family seems to go all the way back down to a region called Silesia, down in the southern part of Poland, which is a sort of another multi-ethnic region. But this guy was from a prominent, upwardly mobile merchant family, and he ended up being sent to university, to the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. He also went to the universities in Cologne and Bologna, which is pretty typical, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we start talking about Nicolaus. He grew up during the 13 Years' War, and his father, who is called Lucas Vatsenrode the Elder, helped to plan the initial uprising in Turon and fought in the battles at Lawson and Malbork, which was the headquarters, the original headquarters of the Teutonic Knights. So his father was in the war against the Teutonic Order, so that probably helped shape his perception. Lucas the Younger joined the priesthood after university, and he was, at a young age, elected to be bishop of this region called Warmia. This was not very popular with the Poles because what the Poles had been kind of arranging for a while was that most of the clergy in Poland were Polish, ethnically Polish folks, and Polish-speaking. These people in Warmia spoke Polish as well as German, but they were primarily German-speaking people, and the Poles were a little bit uneasy with having too many German-speaking prelates. But the Pope backed Lucas von Vatsenrode, and there was actually a conflict that was partially about this. It's called the War of the Priests, and it wasn't really a very active war, but it was sort of a period of hostility where there were some raids and sieges, kind of low-key, you could call it an armed lawsuit that was going on for a while. It's a typical medieval thing. But eventually, Lucas von Vatsenrode turned out to be quite diplomatically adroit, and he managed to convince the Poles that he was a loyal Polish subject. He was a vassal of Poland, and Warmia, under his administration, was going to be pro-Poland, which it was. And he helped in the midst of a bunch of complicated negotiations and diplomacy and maneuvering to establish Warmia as an autonomous bishopric. It used to be under the bishopric of Riga, which is far away in the sort of Livonia part of Baltic, up north. Lucas von Vatsenrode lived in a little village called Lidzbark, near the Baltic coast, and there's not much there except a castle, and it's one of these little church towns, so this is the castle of the Warmian bishops. Vatsenrode not only opposed the Teutonic Knights, but he talked about his opposition in public letters and articulated the point of view that the Teutonic Knights, by the time he was in this position in 1462, had already fulfilled their mission because there were no pagans anymore in the Baltic. There were still, some of the neighbors were Orthodox, but if you really wanted to find somebody that wasn't a Christian to fight, you had to go into the Muslim zone, which would either mean the Mongols or the real big threat at this point emerging was the Ottoman Empire. So he said they should do battle with the Turks. And the Teutonic Knights really hated to hear that because A, fighting the Turks was sort of a death sentence, even for the Teutonic Knights probably, and B, they had conquered this vast area. They had the Orderstaat. It was theirs, and then it was taken away. And from their point of view, it was taken away by treachery. And from the point of view of guys like Lucas, it was taken away by their own incompetence and hubris, overextending themselves and being too inflexible, and being bad diplomats, and so on and so forth. So the Teutonic Knights despised Lucas von Watzenrode. They did not see him as a brother German. They saw him as an enemy and an ally of the Poles, and he preferred the Poles because the Poles were a much more reasonable overlord. They didn't really micromanage. They didn't get involved in what he did as long as he supported the cause and paid his taxes and was an able administrator and so forth. The Poles were able to trade through the region, and that was their main goal. Poland was a huge producer of grain and a lot of other things, salt and metals and other things, but they liked to be, the easy way to trade was going down the rivers, and so they wanted to go down the Vistula River and out into the Baltic, and then the ships from Danzig take the cargo all over the world, and that's what they did, and that's how everybody made a lot of money. So they were eventually, Watzenrode had developed a good relationship with the Polish monarchy and nobility, and he also had friends in the university. He seemed to have close association with some of the humanists that were active in this area. Like there was a guy called Filippo Buonaccorsi who had come from Italy, who had become a courtier of the king and a scholar at the university in Krakow. Von Watzenrode was an able administrator and was known to be a very good diplomat, had a knack for compromise, and was very good at countering all the maneuvers of the Teutonic Knights, who were still around, still causing problems, even though their time is kind of running out. Especially since, as we get into the 16th century, we start having the Protestant Reformation, and the impact of Catholicism in this whole region starts to be undermined. But that's another aspect that's more involved in the life of young Nicholas, who now enters the picture. So von Watzenrode had a son who he was illegally fathered from his mistress, and he helped this guy become the mayor of a small town called Braunsberg. But then his brother died, and that left him in charge of the lives of 5 orphaned children, among whom was Nicolaus Copernicus. That name, there's a bunch of different variations on that name. I'm not going to try to pronounce it in the Polish way or properly. I'm probably not pronouncing the proper German way either. People have killed each other over what's the right name to use and what's the ethnicity of Nicolaus Copernicus, and I think it's extremely tricky to figure that out. Like I said, his family seems to the origins are traced back to a village in Silesia, which is currently in the southern part of Poland, and it was another multi-ethnic region which had German, Polish, Czech, and what are called Sorbian, Slavic ethnic groups, probably some others too. So that further complicates it. Nikolai himself spoke multiple languages. He lived in many different parts of Europe, understood many cultures. He wasn't unusual in this. It was very common for the burger class, for a lot of the church estates that were the higher levels that traveled around. Anybody that went to university, they tended to move around a lot. Artisans and merchants moved around all the time. And there's this thing that makes it hard to pin these people down in that sense that we're more comfortable with today. And we have to ask ourselves why that is. Why do we need people to be German or something? But I would call it, this is something that's, from where I'm from, we have this thing called Creole, which means like the mix of different cultures and ethnic groups, but it really has to do with cultural mix and really understanding your own culture, understanding the culture of your neighbors, and finding sort of synchronies between them and so on. And I think that's very typical in the Middle Ages. I'm not going to get deep into that. We do have a lot of paintings and statues of Copernicus, but we can't say that they're reliable because almost all of them are produced after his death, because that's when he became famous. His famous book on heliocentric theory was published after he died. So during his lifetime, he wasn't really that well known. Nicolaus, was born in 1473 in the town of Turun. His father was a merchant from Krakow. His mother was the daughter of a very rich merchant from Turun who was also a town councillor. His father died in 1483, and that's when Lucas Vatsenrode took him in. And he was the youngest of four. And Lucas took them all on. He married one of the sisters to a merchant from Turun, and she became a prominent citizen and had 5 children. Another one became a Benedictine nun and was later a prioress. One of Nikolai's brother went to university with him and had a pretty good life. And this was all courtesy of their uncle Lucas. So the children went to school in Turun initially, and Nicholas seems to have gone to a school called the St. John's School. This was typical in the towns in this region and throughout Central and Northern Europe. Most children would be educated through the age of 12, and they would be taught reading in the vernacular and a little bit of Latin, and how to read, how to write, and how to do arithmetic. So they were basically literate and numerate, at least in local dialect, vernacular dialect. So that would probably be German, maybe Polish too, maybe some Polish. We know a little bit about what these kids were taught because they used to use these wax tablets. They'd have a little wooden stylus and a tablet that looks sort of like a little iPad, but it's covered in wax. And you'd scratch out what you were writing in it, and then you can kind of rub it out and erase it. And the kids didn't like school all the time. Like a lot of us grew up and didn't enjoy school all the time. And so some of them threw these tablets into latrines, and then archaeologists found them centuries later. So we could actually see half of their homework. They were teaching them, these kids from places like Turun were being taught how to read and write in practical ways. They were teaching them how to write business letters, which had a certain formal, kind of droll, amusingly quality that you notice. I call the late medieval patrician voice that you see in a lot of these kind of letters. But anyway, they would come out of, by the time they were 12, they could read and write, and they were taught math using Fibonacci's Liber Abaci, real good primer on mathematics and on using the Indian type numbers. God forbid you ever have to do your taxes in Roman numerals. The smarter and the better, the smarter and the wealthier or better connected kids like Nikolai, who had a powerful uncle, got to go to what was called the cathedral school. And this was basically like a high school. And there were different forms of these. Most of these were run by the church. Some of the municipal schools were run by the towns because they would have conflicts with some of the church authorities. So the towns by this time had taken over a lot of those. I was not able to determine if the St. John's School was run by the city or by the church. It was a parish school, but I think it might have been taken over by the municipal authorities. I actually saw things claiming both things. But anyway, he went to a cathedral school, like a high school, which was be a very advanced high school. This would be a high school for smart kids. It's not like everybody goes to high school. Only the well-connected, the rich, and or the really smart got to go. And if you were not inclined towards the studies, you weren't going to go to this because it was fairly sophisticated. Here's where they're starting to learn things like the 7 liberal arts, and we'll get into all that stuff in a minute. After he got through that school, which the one he went to, which is a place called Włocławek, and I hope I pronounced that right, it was considered a prep school that led to the university in Krakow, called Jagiellonian University. So that's where Nikolai went, and he registered there as Nikolai de Turonia, a reference to the town that he was born in. And in the university, he studied the 7 liberal arts, which is not like liberal arts universities training we would get today, which is a little bit vague. In this area, it was specific. So there's the trivium, which is grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which is used for public speaking and for writing sort of legal positions and sort of as a precursor for being able to do the work of the law. And then the quadrivium, which is all about math. In theory, it's It starts with arithmetic, then geometry, then music, and then astronomy. And the quadrivium breaks down like this. Arithmetic is just math. Geometry is math over space. Music is math over time. This is the way they looked at it in the Middle Ages, and this goes back to the classical era. And astronomy is math over space and time. And we think that while he was at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, he studied under a guy called Albert Brudzwecki. I'm so sorry for my Polish pronunciation. But Albert Brudzwecki was a professor of the Aristotelian natural philosophy. Aristotle was like the god of late medieval natural philosophy, aka what we call today science and philosophy. And he did a little bit of everything. This same professor, though, was known to have privately taught a sort of a deep dive into astronomy, and he was an advocate. He liked to point out the flaws in the old Greek Ptolemaic model of the solar system that they used, because at the time, astronomy was very closely linked to astrology. I'm going to get into that a little bit more in a minute. But they really were into the planets. And looking at the planets, they could see that the planets did these funny little movements that were hard to explain if they were orbiting the Earth. They did in this era believe in the idea of spheres, so they viewed that the Earth was a sphere, and they thought there was greater spheres outside of the Earth that represented parts of the cosmos, and they thought that the planets went around us, but the planets do this make strange movements they couldn't account for. So this guy, Polish professor, was one of the people that pointed out that there's something odd about that, and that maybe what it means is that the sun was the center, actually, and not the Earth. But you had to be a little bit careful about that because this cosmology was part of the church teaching, so it could get you into dogma, church dogma, because the science at the time was connected to that. It's also believed that Copernicus encountered the work of a German astronomer called Regiomontanus, who was also interested in this idea of heliocentrism. So this is like kind of evidence that really it was not such a huge breakthrough just by Copernicus himself. This was something people were already thinking about. And the tricky part is sort of shoehorning it into the official policies of the church, and because the church is so influential on the scholarly world, which gets you into sort of tricky, legally fraught territory. In this period, astronomy and astrology were closely linked, and it's not because these people were superstitious and stupid, although there was some superstition, but it's because everyone in the world, in every part of the world, was looking at the sky to figure out really important things about life on Earth. They had this idea of as above, so below. Well, that sounds like mumbo jumbo, but if you're looking up, you're going to see the different phases of the moon. The moon goes through in a complete cycle every single month. And you're going to see that the moon affects the tides and the stars. We have the North Star, which is used for navigation, and a lot of other star patterns that can tell you where you are, and also what time of year it is. The stars are a calendar. Stars tell us when the solstices are, the equinox, and that correlates with when is it time to plant, when is it time to harvest, when are the floods coming, and animal migrations. If you plant the crops when it seems warm, but it's really not yet the right time of year, the chances of all your seeds being destroyed in a frost or being flooded or something, and then you don't have any seeds, and then you go through a famine, are really high. So everybody all around the world is paying a lot of attention to the sky, and it's not really clear where the influence of the sky trails off and where does it still matter anymore. So these people still really believed, at least in an allegorical sense, and to some extent probably in a concrete sense, that the planets, including the sun and the moon, affected our lives. And so astrology and sort of mapping out the precise locations and behavior of the celestial objects, especially the planets at this time, was really important. And by the time Copernicus was going to university, it was pretty widely understood amongst certainly certain strata of the educated people that there was something wrong with the Aristotelian Ptolemaic model. So that was sort of in the air. So after attending university in Krakow, Copernicus worked for his uncle for about a year as an advisor and a lawyer. And he wanted to get some more education, and he still hadn't gotten his degree. So he traveled to the University of Bologna in Italy. Bologna was the first university in the world, depending on how you just define a university. It was certainly the first university in Europe. It was still arguably the most important university in Europe at the time. And he traveled there to further study the seven liberal arts, to study medicine, and to delve deeper into astronomy and all kinds of other things. But he did not necessarily just stay the whole time he was in Italy in that one place, because this was very common for people that were going to university in this era to bounce around a lot. They traveled around. There was a term called clerici vaganti. It means vagrant clerics, because people that were studying university were called clerics or clerks. A lot of them ended up in the church. Certainly not all of them, but the concepts overlap. So they called them clerici vaganti, and these people would sort of roam around. Sometimes they were living kind of an itinerant lifestyle. They did get involved in sort of transgressive things sometimes, like wild parties, and they had the famous drunkards mass. And but they also they get involved in sort of political satire and satire against the church. A lot of them were disgruntled. But they would go from place to place. They would usually go from one university town to another, or places where there were a lot of affluent people, and then they could as soon as they learned anything, they could get work as tutors. So if you learned a little bit if you learned the seven liberal arts and you understood geometry of Euclid, you could go and teach that to other students at the university who would pay you directly, or you could go to a noble and offer to teach their children. And so they roamed around a lot. Copernicus did exactly that. He went to Rome, where he worked for a while and studied. He went to the University of Padua, which was another Italian university that was controlled by Venice by this point, and was an extremely well-regarded school. And finally, he received his doctorate of canon law in 1503. And that basically puts the official stamp. Now, another thing that these people would do is roam around until they were able to work out a good deal to get their degree, because it was very expensive. So the changing tides and circumstances would give them opportunities to get the degree for money. So as soon as he got that doctorate, he went back to Warmia to go work for his uncle. And he worked for his uncle as a lawyer. He was a doctor of canon law, so was within the church. He had to deal with canon law a lot. He was also his uncle's personal physician, and he was an administrator. So his official title was canon, which means a clerical administrator that works in the church. He was not really a priest. He wasn't ordained as a priest, but he was in a clerical role. So you could say he was sort of a member of the church, as well as being, he had his feet in two worlds. So he was also a burgher. He continued to be interested in all kinds of things. He published a translation of a 7th century Byzantine historian's collection of poems. That I think that the historian guy has found some earlier poems. He became an advocate of translating lost Greek works, which kind of puts him in the camp of the humanists at that time. And he wrote some of his own Greek poetry. He wrote an epitaph for somebody that died in the Greek style. He and his uncle Lucas also liked to play with lenses, and they were grinding lenses and had some created ground for them. And they were looking at the sky using the lenses and trying to figure out some of the patterns and testing out his emerging theories that he was working on. We know that he had things like an armillary sphere and some other tools that were used in the study of astronomy. He ended up, Nicolaus Copernicus, moved up to the town called Frauenburg, also known as Fromborg, is what it's called today. And this means the city of women. Copernicus used to joke around. He called it the Weberstadt, or Gynopolis, which means the wife's city, wife's town, or woman's town. And what that meant, that had double meaning. It was the town's name, Frauenburg, was named after the Virgin Mary, but it was also very common in this era, especially in this region, because men had a higher mortality rate in general. Just in a normal one of these towns, because of the dangers of work, men had a higher mortality rate. But in this region, there had been wars going on in the 15th and 16th century, and these towns all had militias. So these guys that were working in the town would have to go fight in wars, and they died a lot. So population of the towns a lot of times were majority female, and I don't know for sure, but I believe probable that Frauenburg probably had, might have had like 2/3 female population. Extremely unusual. This town was a little cathedral town though, and so the rulers of the town were the priests and canons and clerks of the church. There's a massive church there that's called the Archcathedral Basilica of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. Andrew of Frauenburg. And if you think I'm going to try to pronounce that in Polish, you are crazy. I won't try to pronounce it in German either. But it was a little cathedral town, so it didn't have a big population. It was an important administrative center for the church, but not didn't have a lot of people there, so they didn't have a strong militia necessarily. And the town had been destroyed a few times over the years. During the Hunger War in 1414, the Teutonic Knights trashed the town. It was captured again during the 13 Years' War, where it had gone out to the side of the Prussian Confederation. It was recaptured by Czech mercenaries under a guy called Jan Skalski on behalf of the Prussian Confederation in 1455, and became part of Poland at the end of the 13 Years' War. In 1519, after Copernicus had been there for a while, another war started warming up between the Teutonic Knights and the Poles. And Copernicus wrote a letter to the King of Poland to ask for help, because he got intelligence that the Teutonic Knights had hired a lot of mercenaries and had an army massing on the border. The Teutonic Knights apparently captured the messenger and got a hold of the letter, and the town was attacked. Copernicus was able to escape. The town did not have that good of a defense. So Copernicus and most of the clerical administrators left. The Teutonic Knights burned the town. Poland sent another army in that managed to push them out again before they destroyed the big church, but the archcathedral. But the town was in bad shape. So Copernicus moved south to another town that the Germans called Allenstein, which is from a native Prussian word called Alna, that means a hind, a type of female deer, usually a red deer. So that was the name Allenstein. The Poles, who also lived in this little town, called it Olsztyn or Olsztyn, which is what it's called today. The population was a mix of German, Polish, and some Prussian or Baltic people. This was typical, again, because these little towns, the birth rate was not quite at replacement, especially, again, in places like this where there's a lot of mortality due to all the fighting going on. So they were bringing more people in from the countryside. So ethnically, a lot of the people there probably were Polish, or largely Polish, but the people that ran these towns, the town council and stuff, were doing all their stuff and all their work in German. So the town, this was the largest town in the district of Warmia, and had a watchtower built there in 1334. The Teutonic Knights started building a big castle there in 1348 to use in the Northern Crusades. The town got municipal rights, meaning its own little charter and a degree of autonomy, in 1353. And the last big upgrade to the castle was done in 1397. The town got captured by the Poles during the Polish-Teutonic War after the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, and it got captured again by the Poles in 1414, but was given back to the Teutonic Order after they signed the treaty to end that war. Joined the Prussian Confederation in 1440, was part of the initial rebellion, but this town was recaptured by the Teutonic Knights and held until 1463 when the Poles took it back. But after the war ended, with the second piece of Torn in 1466, it stayed as part of Poland, and was part of Poland until 1772 when partition. This town was somewhat important as it was on a trade route that went between Warsaw and Königsberg, kind of like the trade between the Teutonic Knights and their remnants in their headquarters today called Kaliningrad, in part of Russia, and big Polish city called Warsaw. Copernicus lived in this town on and off between 1516 and 1521. The town was a fairly thriving place, and it was kind of like one of these typical medieval free cities until 1620, when it was sacked by Swedes, and then there was a long series of catastrophes and decline and going forward after that. So there's not all that much to it as it once was. So this town was besieged in 1521, and so, as I mentioned before, Copernicus ran away from Fromborg or Fallenberg, which in 1519 he went south. The Teutonic Knights had massed a force of about 5,000 soldiers, probably mostly mercenaries, and were conducting raids around Warmia, as is typical in this era of this is early modern period, but it's still basically medieval warfare. There would be raids around the countryside. Most of the people go to the hard points, which are the castles and fortified towns. And attacks on the strong points are kind of few and far between. It has to be very carefully coordinated because the warfare kind of favors the defense. So Copernicus is in Allenstein and asks once again for help. He sends some letters to the powerful Prussian city of Edlag, and asking for some more troops, some more supplies, and he wants 20 more cannon. The militia of the town, when he got there, is only 100 guys, so it's very lightly defended, although the town does have a strongly built castle built by the border. Once again, the letter got intercepted by the agents of the Teutonic Knights, but the Poles learned about the problem, and they sent first a little group of 100 Czech mercenaries. These guys would be hardened professionals, probably a little tough and better equipped than the militia. And then a little later, they send 700 Polish cavalry. The city of Elbing also sent lead, salt, and 16 light artillery guns. So by the end of 1520, the defenders of the town might be as much as about 900 people. It's not clear. Maybe some of them might have left. We don't know for sure. The Teutonic Knights have decided to try to take this town, and they put together a group of 1,400 troops from their army of 5,000. This consists of 400 heavily armed infantry, 600 heavy cavalry, which would mean armored guys on at least partly armored horses, 400 light cavalry, and some light artillery guns. The commander of this group was a guy called Wilhelm von Schaumburg. And I was looking for a painting of this guy, which I couldn't find, but I found effigies of a couple of his contemporaries. There was a guy called Konz von Schaumburg and another guy called Sylvester von Schaumburg, both in the Teutonic Order as well. So we have an idea maybe what this guy looked like in his armor based on his effigy. So what was typical in this time period was that when they wanted to take a fortification like that, you would wait until the first hard freeze, and then the moats freeze solid, and you don't have to worry about getting bogged down in the moat. So sure enough, on January 16, the moats froze, winter's getting cold. The Teutonic Knights decide they're going to make an attempt to storm the castle. So they attacked near the mill gate of the town, the Brama Minska. The knights managed to chop their way through the gate or blast a hole through it, and they started rushing into the first layer of the defenses, and hoping that they could sort of take the whole thing before everybody woke up. But the alarm was sounded. The Polish, Prussian, and Czech forces rallied under the leadership of Nicolaus Copernicus, and they pushed the Teutonic forces back. There's a Polish historian called Jerzy Sikorski, who was one of the people that helped find Copernicus' grave, and he thinks that in this battle, Copernicus actually came out onto the walls of the castle and directed the counterattack. The Teutonic Knights were forced off from the wall, probably with the help of cannons and gunfire, and once all the defenders were at their posts, it was no longer viable to stay within range of those weapons, so they had to back off, and then there was a relieving army that came to drive them away. So not too long after that, the Teutonic Knights, they were, as often happened with their attempts to cause this kind of trouble, they started running out of money. The Poles were putting together a big army. There was a series of negotiations and raids going back and forth, and the armies waxing and waning as they were having financial problems on both sides. Finally, peace was declared in 1525. And shortly after that, the Teutonic Knights converted to Lutheranism, and they became vassals of the King of Poland that same year, more or less taking advantage of the same kind of thing that the towns appreciate and the Prussian Confederation liked about the Poles, which was that they don't really care. You can do your own thing as long as you're loyal to Poland or a vassal of Poland. Although, fortunately for Poland, eventually the Teutonic Knights would be unreliable in that sense, or let's say their descendants. But for now, all the trouble was over. So that's all we got to say about the battle. It wasn't that big or complicated of a battle, and we don't really have like any contemporaneous artwork depicting it. I have found some modern artwork showing sort of fanciful idea what it might have looked like, and really I don't think these are too accurate. But this is an interesting nuance on the life of this guy that we know of as only as an astronomer. Copernicus was a Renaissance man, and he was a man who was exposed to many cultures and had his feet in many different worlds. He probably liked his Weiss beer, but he also liked pierogi, I'm sure. And he could tell jokes in Italian. He could read Byzantine pornography to his maid in Greek. He knew what pasta was. He lived in Italy. Incidentally, he never married, but he did have a 10-year affair with his housekeeper, Anna Schilling. And I couldn't find any pictures of her, but I did Google the name and found a picture of a beautiful German model by that name, so I'm going to just assume that's what his housekeeper looked like. Copernicus could read and write Latin, Greek, German, and Polish, and he probably could also read and write in vernacular Italian. And he could speak all these languages too. So he's a different kind of person than most of our educated people today. His famous treatise, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, was written in Frauenburg and probably complete by the 1430s, or 1530s, I should say. It was published just after he died in 1543. That wasn't the only thing he published. He also published this book of Greek poetry. He published a treatise on monetary reform because inflation and currency devaluation were a major problem in the area. And he actually spoke to the Polish parliament, the Sejm. His epitaph on one of his many monuments reads, "Most renowned astronomer whose name and glory filled both." This was a guy who was glorious in a lot of ways, and he was a remarkable character. He could probably cure you of a serious ailment, even though the knowledge of the time period was somewhat limited. But he was a guy that was known for having cured people. So we know that this is the thing about physicians at the time. They potentially could have cures that are questionable, but some of them worked, and his apparently worked. He cured a bunch of people. He knew grammar and logic and rhetoric and could use that in the service of practicing law. He knew mathematics and the geometry of Euclid and Vitruvius, and he could use it to help understand the movements of the stars and plan it out and be able to write his treatise. When he wrote that treatise, it was not necessarily, he wasn't the first person to think about this. He wasn't the first person to discuss it. He wrote it really as a legally defensible argument in favor of this as a policy change, essentially as a policy change for the church. That's why it was published post-mortem, because he's sort of entering the argument about what is the canon, what is accepted as church policy, and that's where it gets you into like hacking the religion, which is technically where the heresy starts. The church was not against technology or figuring things out. Very much to the contrary. That's what the church had a lot of influence or control. All the universities, and they wanted to figure out as many things as they could so that Christendom would be strong compared to their many rivals. This guy probably wasn't super religious, but he was technically himself of the church. He worked as an employee of his uncle and as administrator for the church. He was a canon. He was not a stupid guy, and we would assume that anybody from there. Many people, if I talk to them, are going to just instantly assume that means you're stupid. Oh, what does he know? He's never even played with a computer. He's never picked up a smartphone. He's never flown in an airplane or driven in a car. So, what do they know? But he knew a lot. And I think today, partly because of our own hyper specialization in the way we think about things, and the way that whatever our profession is, we know about that, but we don't really explore everything the way these people did, and that's very limiting for us, because that means our understanding is sort of stripped down to the level of sound bites, very simplistic kind of tropes and cartoonish cliches. And this is a guy who's a good example of somebody who does not fit those cliches. We focus a lot on things like ethnicity. In Copernicus' time, there was certainly bigotry, there was sectarianism, but it was based on religious affiliation and political affiliation, and what languages you spoke. And a lot of people that were sort of at that strata that he was in, he was not in the peak strata of his time, he was in the upper middle strata of his time. And those kind of people often spoke many languages, often lived in many parts of the world. Part of how an average, typical college kid would get their education. They would move around from school. They didn't spend their whole time in one school. And this is also how artisans moved around, and how merchant journeymen moved around, and lots of people. So he was somebody who had his feet in many worlds. He was not a one-trick pony. And maybe there's something that we can learn from that. And maybe the genius brains that can figure out the incredibly complicated and sophisticated theories of physics and astronomy that we rely on today to help us understand those things can also do other stuff. They can also be Renaissance men, and some of them are Renaissance. I say Renaissance man because that's the phrase that was used in later eras, but this also applies to people like Christine de Pizan, who was just as capable in this sense. So anyway, that's your little trip down the time tunnel into 4 centuries in the past, when this astronomer fought off the Teutonic Knights with no task. And I hope you liked it, and I'll talk to you and then do the next one.